Good morning, my brothers and sisters. Welcome to episode 113 of Be With Me in the book of Acts. And today's title is Have an Occupation, comma, Be Occupied With. We're following the footsteps of Paul through the book of Acts. Now, there's a couple of other main players, Silas and Timothy, and they've been on another journey. We'll talk about that in a second. So Paul has been on the Macedonian peninsula. Down south of it is Athens, so he's gone from Philippi to Thessalonica to Berea, kind of working his way south. And then he goes by boat because of persecution to 222 miles down to Athens. And then today he goes 50 miles west to Corinth. Now, Corinth is important in all kinds of different ways, but just for today, it is the high water mark of the second missionary journey. That is, it's as far away from his home base in Antioch and Jerusalem as he ever gets on the second missionary journey. Now, we know exactly when this is because of like a timestamp that's given in the story. That is, it's just past 50 AD, and we find that Paul is now in Corinth and he's occupied with the word. Listen in with me. This is from Acts chapter 18. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a Jew named Aquila, that's a guy, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius, the Roman emperor, had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them. And because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. This is Paul's occupation. Verse 4, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade Jews and Greeks, those would be the devout people in the temple area. Verse 5, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was, and I love this, occupied with the word, testifying to the Jews that the Christ was Jesus. And when they opposed and reviled him, he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. And he left there and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord together with his entire household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing Paul, believed and were baptized. Okay, so 8 verses today, and it's a smorgasbord of people. First of all, we've got Paul in his travels. Secondly, we have Aquila, who's this guy who has to leave Italy because he's a Jew. Now, we know that was in 49 AD, was when Claudius, the emperor, kicked the Jews out of Rome. So this is after 49 AD, probably 50 or 51 AD, because he had to go and buy a house and get a trade going in Athens, or in correct. We were in Athens, now we're in Corinth. His wife is Priscilla, and these are real biblical heroes. They're mentioned a whole bunch in the New Testament. Stick around, Aquila and Priscilla. They're going to be mentioned as having a witness in Corinth here. Then they're going to go to Ephesus, and then finally in Rome. So they're mentioned a bunch of times in the New Testament. So they're workers. They take their work with them, which is tent making. And think about this, is who wouldn't like to have Paul as a house guest where he stayed and broke bread with them? And maybe Timothy as well, and maybe Silas. And I think when we get to heaven, wouldn't you want to have lunch with these guys? Well, Priscilla and Aquila actually did. And in fact, he stayed with them. So what a great exposure to these great men of God, and they finish well, which is really great. All right, it's mentioned in verse 5, that Silas and Timothy arrived back from Macedonia. Now, scholars say that Paul was chased out of Berea by the Jews that had come from Thessalonica to stir up the crowds. And so they ran him down to the coast. He traveled by boat 222 miles to Athens. And eventually it is thought that Silas and Timothy caught up with Paul down in Athens. But they didn't stay there. They went back up to Macedonia to encourage the believers there. And this is what this refers to, is now they're arriving from Macedonia, not to Athens. They're arriving from Macedonia to Corinth, 50 miles away. And what do they find? They find that Paul is occupied. Now, not just by tent making. It says he's occupied. His occupation was tent making, but he was occupied by the word. And I just love that. So what word is that? Two things. Number one is, what is the word at that period of time? There is no New Testament really at that time. So the occupation with the word is the Old Testament. And that's sort of like the old version of the word. The new version of the word is the Lord is inspiring Paul and using Paul to write the New Testament. So it's here in Corinth that Paul writes the New Testament, specifically 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. So not only has Paul sent his buddies Silas and Timothy back up to the Macedonian peninsula, he's going to write them. How many times? Twice. And in this chapter of the book of Acts, chapter 18, there's this time that just relaxes a little bit, because we find in a couple of verses down the road here, we find that he's going to stay for 18 months and be occupied with the word. So everything takes a chill pill just a little bit here. Finally, Paul changes venues after he gets opposition, and he stays with the family of Titius Justus, who's a Gentile. Then it mentions that the Jewish guy who runs the synagogue becomes a believer. He's mentioned again as a guy who was physically baptized by Paul, which was rare. So, all right, so it's a couple of teaching points. Number one, have an occupation, but be occupied with the word. Don't be surprised when you get some opposition to the message. He also gets opposition to his person, that he is reviled. The message is opposed and Paul is reviled. All right, a real smorgasbord today, but I think the call today is have an occupation, but be occupied with the word. Thanks for listening. I'll see you tomorrow.